I'd like to continue looking with you at the history of the ancient world as told through the eyes of the Bible. Now, today we continue our study on the book of Joshua. And so I want to begin with a review, just to remind us of what's happened so far and what we know so far. And the first thing is that God promised Joshua that he would give him victory. And then Joshua sent out the spies to look at the first major city that needed to be taken, and that was Jericho. And Rahab gave the model for survival. If you live in the land, you need to change allegiance. And then the children of Israel crossed the Jordan River, which was at flood stage, and they crossed on dry ground. And that was an incredible miracle. They followed the Lord's battle plan, and they took Jericho without loss of life on the Israelite side, and thus splitting the land in half. Now they destroyed the city, and everything in it except for Rahab and her family, because she changed allegiance. And then they were told that everything in the city belonged to God. But one man took some of the spoils for himself, stealing from God and committing treason. And when they attempted to take a smaller city without asking God for advice, they were beaten because of Achan's sin. And then Achan was tried for treason, and then they went after Ai again, and this time they won. Then after they won in Ai, the Gibeonites knew that they couldn't stand against the children of Israel, and so they did whatever it took to come under the rule of the most powerful God that they had ever heard of, Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. And then the kings of the cities to the south of Jericho decided to fight rather than to give in to the rule of Yahweh. And they lost, and all the cities of the south were destroyed. And this is where we find ourselves so far. Joshua and the children of Israel now control the land immediately to the east of the Jordan, and they control the land to the south of the Jordan. And so next, on Digging Deeper, I want to take a look at with you at the Northern Campaign. There is nothing really new when we begin to look at the Northern Campaign as described for us in Joshua chapter 11. The people of the land will still choose to fight, and they will still lose. And I think it's telling because the people of the land are so indicative of people throughout the history of mankind. And so I'd like to look with you briefly at 5 things. 4 of them I want to go over quickly, and then I want to spend some time on the last point. Now, the first thing that we find is the kings are still rebelling. In Joshua chapter 11, the first 5 verses, it records this for us. It says, when Jabin, the king of Hazor, heard of this, what happened in the south, he sent Jobab, the king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and to the king of Ashapah, and to the kings who were in the northern hill country, and in the Arabah south of Chinneroth, and in the lowland, and in Naphroth, Dor, on the west, to the Canaanites in the east and the west, and the Amorites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Jebusites in the hill country, and the Hivites under Hermon in the land of Mizpah. And they came out with all of their troops, a great horde in number like the sand that is on the seashore, and with many horses and chariots. And all these kings joined their forces and came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. Now, I got to tell you, folks, these 5 verses have never made a lot of sense to me. So here we have the nation of Israel. Now, forget about their God if you want to. But here is the list of daring do. They somehow defeated the pantheon of Egypt. They were expelled from the country when the eldest child of the Egyptians was found dead one morning. They lured the Egyptian army into the Red Sea, and all were drowned. And then they survived 40 years in the wilderness, defeating any king that came up against them. And in fact, they walked through the Jordan River at flood stage. And they defeated a very formidable, heavily defended city, Jericho, in just a matter of days. And then they not only defeated the small town of Ai, but they defeated the entire Southern Alliance. And the only people still alive in the south were the Gibeonites, who made a deal with them and joined the family. So this group of people, they are untouchable. And yet the kings of the north still decided to fight. Now, folks, there's a principle for us. You see, even though fighting God makes no sense, people will still attempt it. And we see that in our world today. Fighting against Yahweh still makes no sense whatsoever, and yet people still do it almost every day. Which brings us to the second observation that I have, if you will. And that is that, again, God promises and God delivers victory. So God promises Joshua he's going to win, and then he actually delivers on that promise. In verse 6, it says, "And the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid of them. For tomorrow at this time I will give over all of them, slain, to Israel. And you shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire." And so Joshua and all his warriors came suddenly against them by the waters of Merom. And they fell upon them, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Israel, who struck them and chased them as far as the great Sidon and Israphoth-Maim, and eastward as far as the valley of Mizpah. And they struck them until he left none remaining. And Joshua did to them just as the Lord said to him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. And so the result of fighting against the Lord, it is always the same. Folks, God will always win. And so Joshua was playing with house money, if you will. He had no pressure whatsoever because he was doing what God told him to do. And now, again, I want you to remember, there needn't be any bloodshed. Again, for all those who are saying that God is some homicidal maniac or some genocidal, cruel person or whatever, there didn't need to be bloodshed. The issue was the people and the kings of the north, they were rebelling and they were fighting against the God of Israel. And folks, when you fight against the God of Israel, whenever you go into a battle, there are always one of two possibilities. Either you're going to win or you're going to lose. I can tell you, if you're going to battle against the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, you're going to lose that one. And so the blood was on their heads. It was on their shoulders. All the people who died there. It was not God's fault. It was not Joshua's fault. It was their fault for fighting against him. They were the ones who came to battle against Israel. You see, the Gibeonites showed us the key, that all who call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. And these kings decided to fight, and they lost. And they understood that going in. And so there's a principle here for us. And I think it's one that's very important. And that is that God will always do what he says he will do. God promised Joshua that he would win. And he won. Now, the third thing that we see as we continue through this passage is that we see justice is handed out. Look with me at verse 10. It says, "And then Joshua turned back at that time, and he captured Hazor and struck its king with the sword. For Hazor formerly was the head of all of those kingdoms, and they struck with the sword all who were in it, devoting them to destruction. And there was none left that breathed. And he burned Hazor with fire. And all the cities of those kings and all of their kings Joshua captured and struck them with the edge of the sword, devoting them to destruction, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. But none of the cities that stood on mounds did Israel burn, except Hazor alone. That Joshua burned. And all the spoil of these cities and the livestock and the people of Israel took for their plunder. But every man they struck with the edge of the sword, until they had destroyed them. And they did not leave any who breathed, just as the Lord had commanded Moses, his servant. So Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses." So, folks, we have seen this and we've been over this before. So I don't want to belabor the point. The sentence for treason is and always has been death. The king of Hazor brought the people to ruin because he somehow thought he could beat the God of the Israelites. And the principle for us is that no one can defeat the God of the Israelites. All who try find out to their peril that they were wrong. Now I want to make one more statement. I want to talk one more time about this whole genocidal thing, because I see so much hypocrisy going on in our world today. Okay, the same people who will say that God is genocidal by having all the people in Canaan who were fighting against him taken out are the same ones who will say, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Folks, the only way that that can happen is to destroy every Jew in Israel. Folks, that's a definition of genocide. So don't tell me that God is some genocidal maniac here. The people in the land were fighting. I'm a military guy. I was in 3rd Armored Division. I can tell you this, folks. Somebody came up against us and they began to fight as Iraq tried in the first Gulf War, and they got their butts kicked by 3rd Armored Division. They came up, they attacked, we went back, and we absolutely destroyed them. That's what happens in war. That was their choice to make. The land belongs to God. God gave that land to Israel. He pulled Abraham and his family out until the sin of the people in the land had been fully accomplished. Then he brought them back in as instruments of justice. And the people in the land, they had a choice. They could give in or they could fight. Everyone who fought was going to die. And that had nothing to do with genocide. It had nothing to do with anything other than the wages of sin is death. Let's continue on. Just had to get that off my chest. And so the last thing that we see here, we see the finishing of the task in the beginning of verse 16, where it says, and so Joshua took all that land, the hill country, and all of the Negeb, all the land of Goshen, and the lowland, and the Arabah, and the hill country of Israel, and its lowland from Mount Halak, and which rises towards Seir, and as far as Baal-Gad, in the valley of Lebanon, below Mount Hermon. And he captured all their kings and struck them and put them to death. Joshua made war a long time with all those kings, and there was not a city that made peace with the people of Israel except the Hivites and the inhabitants of Gibeon. They took them all in battle. For it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts that they should come against Israel in battle, in order that they should be devoted to destruction, and should receive no mercy but be destroyed. Just as the Lord commanded Moses, and Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all of the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction with their cities. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel, only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. And so Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses. And Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments, and the land had rest from war. So Joshua finished the work. He finished the work that he had started. He destroyed all of the people who fought against the Lord, or those who would not submit to the rule of Yahweh. And folks, I just want us to stop and think about something. This is the story of humanity. Now, we've gone over all of this before. Paul tells us that sin came into the world when the first man, Adam, sinned. When he decided for himself what was right and wrong. And he passed the stain of sin to all people who have an earthly father. And that would be every person on the planet except for one. So every person on the planet, just like the people in the land, they're all under the sentence of death. You see, folks, we are sinners by birth and by behavior. And it doesn't take long for us to begin to decide what is right and wrong, instead of following the edicts of the rightful king of the world. The only one who has the right to decide what is right and wrong. And people still fight against the rule of Yahweh, even when it makes no sense. People hang on to evolution when they know that the data does not support it. Atheism is so in vogue among young people today. And the idea that we can live without the shackles of a God is so tempting. And people fight, and they fight, and they fight. And they continue to serve the old gods, Baal, Asherah, and Molech. The Bible tells us that narrow is the way that leads to salvation, but broad is the path that leads to destruction. And folks, this is truth. The only way to stave off ultimate death is to align with the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Listen to the account of the final battle, the battle where proud mankind thinks it can defeat a righteous God. We find it in Revelation chapter 19, beginning in verse 9, where it says, "And the angel said to me, write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb." And he said to me, these are the true words of God. Then I fell down at his feet to worship him. But he said to me, "You must not do that, for I am a fellow servant with you and your brothers who hold on to the testimony of Jesus. Worship God." The testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. And then I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and he makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems. And he has a name written that no one knows but himself, and he is clothed in a robe dipped in blood. And the name by which he is called is the Word of God. And the armies of heaven, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. And from his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations. And he will rule them with a rod of iron. And he will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. And on his robe and on his thigh he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And then I saw an angel standing in the sun. And with a loud voice he called out to all the birds that fly directly overhead, "Come and gather for the great supper of God, to eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, and the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses and their riders, and the flesh of all men, both free and slave, both small and great." And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth with their armies gathered to make war against him who was sitting on the horse and against his army. And the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet, who in its presence had done the signs by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped its image. And these two were thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. And the rest were slain by the sword that came from the mouth of him who is sitting on the horse, and all the birds were gorged with their flesh. Folks, the rebellion against God always ends in sorrow and pain. But the good news that we have to share is that God has made a way. And that way is Jesus. He is the door to the fold. He is the resurrection and the life. He who believes in him will live even if he dies. This is not God being cruel. This is actually perfect justice. The sin in Canaan is the same as the sin in the end of times. And it is the sin of the people who are fighting God today. It's rebellion. It's treason. And justice must be served. For you see, heaven and hell, grace and judgment are all parts of God's justice. Not one is not his justice, and the other one is grace. No, they're both a part of his justice. There is grace in Joshua, just as there is grace throughout the rest of history. Salvation comes and only comes by aligning with the kingdom rule of Yahweh. That means admitting our sin, asking for forgiveness and repenting of that sin, and then asking God to forgive and transform us. This is a prayer that God will always answer in the affirmative, because this is the gospel. And I want to end this message today. I want to end this talk by highlighting something. I want to highlight an easily overlooked sentence in Joshua. It's found in chapter 11, verses 21 and 22. It says, "And Joshua came at that time, and he cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them all to destruction with their cities. There was none of the Anakim left in the city of the people of Israel. I'm sorry, in the land. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. Did you catch that? There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel, only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. Now, the author is telling us here that there is going to be a very subtle but a very important shift from here on out. With these 3 sentences, the entire history of the nation will change. And we'll begin to discuss that when next we meet. So I thank you for making it to the end today as we continue to look at the history of the world. And I hope that this is making the Bible make a little bit more sense to you as we begin to find more of the flow of the story of the history. And so I pray that as you are worshiping the Lord, that you really see him for who he is. You have a phenomenal time with your siblings in Christ. And I look forward to seeing you again in a future video. God bless you all.